Good evening, everyone. My name is Nikki Freeman, and I'm the Director of Education at the Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's program, which is part of Holocaust Education Week. During the next week, we are offering a series of educational programming that considers the legacy of the Holocaust through cultural, academic, and personal perspectives. We are putting our website with more information about Holocaust Education Week in the chat, and we hope that you will join us for future programs. Before we begin, I would like to extend special thanks to the State of Florida's Department of Education, the State of Florida's Division of Arts and Culture, the City of Miami Beach's Cultural Affair Program and Cultural Arts Council, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their ongoing support. So Hamas's attack against Israel and its civilians on October 7th, 2023 was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. Almost 80 years after the horrors of the Holocaust, how was this attack humanly possible? Tonight, we are joined by world-renowned Holocaust scholar, Dr. Michael Berenbaum, for an informative and thoughtful discussion about the events currently unfolding in Israel. Dr. Berenbaum is the director of the Ziggy Ziering Institute and professor of Jewish Studies at the American Jewish University. From 1988 to 1993, he served as project director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, overseeing its creation. He's also the author and editor of 20 books, scores of scholarly articles, and hundreds of journalistic pieces. And perhaps most important to us, he's a good friend of us at the Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach. So Michael, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you very much. In one sense, I would say it's a pleasure to be here, but I'm not sure that there are many pleasures during this period of time. I'm going to do the following and really ask your assistance. I'm going to speak for a little bit, and then what I really want to do is to respond to questions that you have, and therefore be able to address your concerns and deal with the whole range of issues. Obviously, October 7th was a horrific day in Jewish life, and it's challenged some of the basic let me say one more thing. We normally try to keep all of these events, as it were, non-controversial and non-political, but we have to admit that this is not a moment in which one can speak about all the events taking place without creating controversy for some, and also without grappling with some of the important and significant political issues today, political issues in the United States, political issues in Israel as well. October 7th was a difficult and painful day in international Jewish life and even in the world community. And especially it has challenged a whole range of assumptions that we had made about post-Holocaust Jewish life, and essentially the whole range of decisions that had been made regarding the Jewish future. Let me begin by telling you that this is not the Holocaust, but by telling you it's not the Holocaust, that does not mean it's not serious and conditions are not ominous. It's just telling you it's something else, and we have to begin to understand in a very deep way the differences that are involved. The best analogy to what happened on October 7th is to think of it as a pogrom, or actually a series of pogroms. Pogroms were traditionally an attack on civilian population by a mob bent on their destruction. And essentially, in this case, it was not only bent on their destruction, the victims were men, women, and children. You had instances in which children, the young and the old, children were beheaded. And there were two very unique aspects to this attack. Number one, the killers themselves had smiles on their faces. And how do we know this? Because they broadcast in a very real sense what they were doing. In other words, they were proud of what they were doing and they broadcasted it back. And secondly, what was also distinct, you even had one case in which somebody shared this with his parents expecting to be congratulated for his role in killing Jews. And consequently, you had a dramatic instance of a pogrom. There was rape, there was beheading, there was violation. The attacks were men, women, and children, the young and the old. And again, as a tactic of war and battle, they took a series of hostages. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 230 hostages were taken into Gaza by the attackers. In traditional, and this attack, by the way, towers over the attacks that we have seen in traditional Jewish history. The attacks, most especially of Kishinev in 1906, which transformed Jewish history because it established the narrative that Jews could not live in Russia, and consequently there was a dramatic attempt to leave Russia after 1906. Many came to the United States and Canada. Fewer, but a significant percentage of the people came to the land of Israel, to Palestine, in order to settle the land and rebuild their lives, understanding that they could not live where they were, they had to get out. The second pogrom that we want to speak of is a pogrom whose anniversary we commemorate in another 3 days, and that is what we normally used to refer to as Kristallnacht, but which we now call the November Reichspogroms of 1938. Why do we not call it Kristallnacht? Because crystal is somehow beautiful. It was a term that the Germans introduced to refer to the events, which somehow robbed it of its violence and of its ugliness in a particular way. So the November pogroms were essentially a coordinated attack throughout Germany, and notice I'm using the word plural, coordinated attack throughout Germany on the more than 1,000 synagogues, more than 7,500 Jewish businesses, and more than the arrest of 30,000 men aged 16 to 60, and the murder of 91 Jews. But we have to understand that this was, as I've called it in my own scholarship, the end of the beginning and the beginning of the end, because the Holocaust itself was a systematic state-sponsored murder of millions of Jews, what they called extermination, what we want to refer to in non-Nazi speak as annihilation. And the murder of the Jews that was involved, essentially, was a systematic program at total annihilation. It ultimately incorporated 22 different countries and involved the entire continent of Europe with the rarest of exceptions. We can even point to the exceptions: Ireland, Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain, but the continent of Europe, and it was part of a program of total and complete annihilation. Saying it's not the Holocaust does not diminish for one moment its importance. It just means that let's not exaggerate what happened. Let's consider it in an important context, and let's also not attack what we would call the distinctness, the unprecedentedness, the uniqueness of the Holocaust itself. What did this call into question? And its aftermath also calls into question. But first, let's ask the question, why did this happen now? And I think we have to pay serious attention to why it happened now. And the answer to that, I believe, will be given by history, is because there was a potential that was coming close to an agreement between Saudi Arabia and the United States and Israel for the quotation marks normalization of relationships between the Saudi Arabia and Israel. And with that, you would have had a major move toward the acceptance of Israel as an integral part of the region. And it would have meant that the Sunni Shiite division would have intensified with Israel being allied with the Saudi Arabians and with the whole range of Muslim communities against Iran, and essentially even with the Muslims trusting Israel with nuclear weapons to counteract the nuclear weapons that Iran has, at least in potentia. Whenever there is the option of peace, the radicals, the extremists on both sides, seek to sabotage that peace. And a week ago, we commemorated the anniversary of the murder of Yitzhak Rabin, in which, again, a Jewish extremist sought to sabotage the peace process. So one of the reasons why it happened now was to attack the possibility of the normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the breaking of the barrier within the Muslim communities for the recognition of Israel. What was challenged by what happened on October 7th? First of all, the biggest challenge is that in every other case of a pogrom, the Jewish people held the government in power responsible for that pogrom. And remember, even back to 1982, when you had the Christian phalangists attacking the Palestinians in the outskirts of Beirut, the commission, in the aftermath of that attack, when essentially Christians killed Muslims, Jews were held responsible by Jews for that because they were the government in control of Beirut. And they were the government that was occupying at that point Lebanon. And that's the moment at which officers and ministers of the IDF were removed from their task. And they were removed from their task not by outsiders, but by Jews holding account. This time, the government in control was the government of Israel, which failed in its most basic responsibility, which is to keep the citizens of Israel safe, and failed in that sense with what the Jews had placed on as the major decision in the aftermath of the Holocaust, that the future of the Jewish people and the safety of the Jewish people resided in a Jewish state which had a flag, a language, a land, and an army. And the army of Israel and the intelligence apparatus of Israel and the government of Israel failed on that basic task. That will be suspended. The judgment on that will be suspended. It will be suspended to a government commission that will be appointed in the aftermath. But suffice it to say, this is a shock, an existential shock to Israel. The second thing that happened in its aftermath, and we've been moving toward this in a very problematic way, has been the explosion of anti-Semitism within America, Canada, Europe, and within the free world. That explosion of anti-Semitism has now accelerated. Those of you who've heard me speak on anti-Semitism understand that we have to have a sophisticated understanding of anti-Semitism. And let me put it to you very carefully and very concisely. Anti-Semitism differs as to its source: religious, political, economic, social, in the Nazi case, racial. Anti-Semitism differs as to its goal. If you have religious anti-Semitism, the goal is to convert Jews. If you have political anti-Semitism, and we've seen examples of political anti-Semitism in the chanting of "the Jews will not replace us," in the attempt to diminish Jewish political power, in the attempt on certain parts of the American universe to speak of establishing the Christian nation and Jews as an obstacle to establishing a white Christian nationalist movement. If it is economic power, it's the myth of Jews control the economy. We want to diminish Jewish economic power. Jewish political power sometimes has been diminished in the past by expelling the Jews. And in the German case, in the Nazi case during World War II, with all due respect to Whoopi Goldberg, who didn't understand this, it was racial because the Jews were defined biologically based on the religion of their grandparents. And that meant that if you had Jewish blood in you going back for 2 generations, you were defined as a Jew, and racial anti-Semitism had no cure except for what the Germans called extermination, what we would call because we don't want to get the idea that you exterminate people, what we would call annihilation. Anti-Semitism also differs as to its priority. One of the reasons Jews have been safe in the United States, has been safer in the United States over time, has been that because the priority of victimization was never on the Jews. We were not number 1, we were not number 2, we were not number 3. In fact, we were often number 4, 5, 6, even beyond that, in terms of the priority for anti-Semitism. Contrast this with Nazi Germany, in which we were number 1. We were the primary concern of Adolf Hitler from 1919 to his final breath in 1945, where he admonished the German people not to continue the attack against the Jews in his last will and testament. And we were such a priority when the choice came between the war effort and the annihilation of the Jews. The annihilation of the Jews took a priority. I always say humorously, it's a race you do not want to win. And consequently, that's one of the questions of priority. And right now, in the world community, for many people, anti-Semitism is a priority, a very high priority. And anti-Semitism also occurs within a context, and this is the context of the stability of society. And the stability of the society, the basic rule is Jews are like a canary in the mine. The canary is put in the mine because if there is a lack of oxygen, the canary feels that before the human being. And Jews are canary in the mine. If there is anti-Semitism, it means society is unstable. The more stable the society, the more secure its Jewish community. The more unstable the society, the more unstable the world, the more insecure its Jewish community, and the more danger is posed to them. But certain things were not supposed to happen in the United States. Things that were not supposed to happen in the United States is the Jews had broken the glass ceiling. We were now regarded as an acceptable part of American society, at home in the university, at home on campuses, at home on elite campuses. More than 2 decades ago, when Harvard Hillel moved from the periphery of the Harvard campus to the center, the provost of Harvard, Henry Wasowski, himself a survivor, a refugee from the Holocaust, a quasi-survivor of the Holocaust, said the Jews have now moved from the periphery of Harvard to the center of Harvard, and here we intend to stay. And we had a unique period of time in which Jews were not only free to participate in American society, but they were free to participate in American society as Jews, as active and as open Jews, without being subject to attack. And a good example of that was when Joe Lieberman was nominated for Vice President of the United States. You not only nominated a Jew for the second highest office in the nation, but you nominated a Jew who was speaking about working 24/6, not 24/7, because for him the Sabbath was sacred. and you had the participation of Jews who felt comfortable being Jews in the center of American national life. And that's now being challenged, ironically, at some of the major significant American universities, elite American universities, places where Jews had felt particularly comfortable and particularly at home. They now feel themselves endangered, and that again becomes deeply and profoundly problematic. Hamas knew that the response to an attack would be Israel would go after Hamas. And notice I'm using a language which is very important. Israel is at war with Hamas. It is not at war with the Palestinian people. And the reason for that is because even after the defeat of Hamas, however complete, however total, the Palestinian people will continue to be the neighbors of Israel. A segment of them will be citizens of Israel. But Hamas understood that Israel would attack Hamas in retaliation, and it understood also that because of the way in which it conducted itself, and that is, it conducted itself by placing major military elements both underground and under major institutions in the Gaza Strip. Those institutions include schools, mosques, and hospitals, that Israel would attack it, and it was hoping that Israel would attack it wantonly, and consequently you would have the images of major Israeli killings. Israel would then be called brutal murderers, etc., and would erase the stain of what Hamas did and the brutality specifically of what Hamas did. Israel has engaged in a very particular strategy, and a very important strategy. It must reestablish its own sense of deterrence. Reestablishing its own sense of deterrence means that you understand if you attack Israel, there is a deep and a profound price to pay, and consequently you don't attack Israel, and it must reestablish its own sense of security. It faces the possibility of a four-front war. War in Gaza against Hamas, war in the Lebanon area and in the Israel north against Hezbollah. We've seen also attacks already from Syria. And finally, it has the potential for unrest in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank, which would give it a forefront war. And therefore, it is in a very difficult situation. And its problems in fighting Hamas is precisely that it appears to be wantonly destroying segments of Gaza and institutions of Gaza. Some of these reports, by the way, are false, and some of them are unverifiable. We've seen the best example of falsehood, Israel's alleged bombing of the hospital in Gaza. Hamas announced Israel had bombed the hospital, 500 dead. Period of time Israel denied the bombing. The President of the United States sustained that denial. Turned out that the hospital was not attacked. It was the parking lot adjacent to the hospital. It was not bombed, but it was an exploded missile that had been misdirected by other Palestinian sources in Gaza. And the number 500 was an invented number. And yet the media continues to rely upon the same sources that invented the 500 number, invented the whole range of numbers as to those murdered, designed to project Israel as killers and world jury as supporting of that killing, including the accusation that Israel is perpetuating a genocide being even made by a representative in the Congress of the United States. Israel is not committing genocide. I know a little bit about genocide. I've only studied it for the bulk of my professional life. And let me give you a couple of ways to respond to that. Israel has the power to commit genocide. It has the provocation to commit genocide. It has deliberately never committed genocide in this. And the evidence of that is a couple of fold that you hear time and again. Number one, population in the West Bank is increasing significantly, reproducing and increasing in numbers. The population in Gaza is increasing and reproducing in numbers. And notice what they say, that more than 1 in 2, more than 50%, some even use the statistic, 60% of the population are children. In cases in which a society is the victim of genocide or about to be the victim of genocide, there's a deterioration, there's a dramatic drop in the birth rate because parents don't dare to bring children into such a world. And that's material evidence that genocide is not being committed. Question, some will say, is Israel engaging in proportionate use of force? Proportionate use of force is a question of judgment and balance. It must use force in order to uncover the layers of military installations and tunnels and the locations of the military installations and tunnels. And one of the things to notice very specifically is that Israel is issuing warnings by dropping leaflets, by making telephone calls, by indicating what buildings will be attacking, by even establishing a corridor by which to evacuate populations, with the idea that it does not want to kill civilians, and the hampering of the evacuation of civilians from these areas is being done by Hamas. Notice also that Gaza has two borders, one border with Egypt and one border with Israel. And when they speak about Israel closing off its borders with the Gaza, Egypt is also doing that. And Egypt itself is in a situation where whatever it says publicly, it is privately, quietly, not displeased that Israel is attacking Hamas, because Hamas is allied with the enemy of the Egyptian government, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. We are in for a period of time. This will be a long battle. This will be a long war. This will be a war that will be slow, and we're in for a stake of enormous negative imagery with regard to Israel. Now, let's tell you a couple of good things, which again indicates something we have to recognize as important, significant, and dramatically different from the Holocaust. Number one, political leaders have expressed solidarity with Israel. The behavior of the President of the United States, who went to Israel, went to a war zone, and again met with the Israeli government and has made all the proper statements. The efforts again and again and again of Secretary of State Anthony Blinken are dramatic and significant. And even the United States, which has asked for a humanitarian pause, has not called for a ceasefire, understanding why no ceasefire, because ceasefire at this moment would leave the hostages in captivity, and would also, more importantly, though I say this with pain in my heart, because I care for the hostages, including the nephew of one of my closest friends, it would also leave in the situation, it would leave Hamas as the victor having attacked and then preserved its leadership, which would only encourage future attacks. That's why Israel's rejecting calls for ceasefire. And let's recall polemically, but very importantly, that there was a ceasefire on October 6th, and the violators of the October 6th ceasefire were Hamas, who violated on October 7th, wants to attack and then reestablish a ceasefire and escape from the punishment inflicted upon them or the retaliation inflicted upon them for that ceasefire. Let's talk and let's also say Israel has been facing a crisis of deep and profound divisions at home. The government of Israel will be held accountable for its failures. It will probably also be held accountable for the exacerbating the divisions at home, and it may be held accountable in a dramatic way if the West Bank catches on fire. And right now it's intriguing because the Palestinian Authority, which the government of Israel, the current government of Israel, tried to diminish in power and influence and to sidestep, the Palestinian Authority has kept a lid on the West Bank, and the IDF has to keep a lid on the settlers from exploiting this moment to achieve some gains in the West Bank. The government of Israel will be held accountable. It will not be held accountable until after the war because of the nature of how power has to be distributed. The Prime Minister of Israel is deeply weakened, and evidence of that is easy. There is not a great deal of trust in the Prime Minister of Israel and in the leadership of the government, though there is trust now that Benny Gantz has joined the National Unity Government. And the best example of that is the fact that when the Prime Minister of Israel spoke to the nation in the equivalent of an Oval Office address, immediately thereafter, the defense minister spoke and Benny Gantz spoke, the third minister who's part of the war cabinet, which meant that the Prime Minister of Israel did not have the credibility that was necessary to achieve it. Two comments about the anti-Semitism we're experiencing at home in the United States, in Canada, and North America, and the like. The first is that we have had a very unique period of time in Jewish history, an almost unprecedented time in Jewish history, in which it was easy to be a Jew. Easy to be a Jew, first of all, the resources that were available to us, the opportunities available to us are extraordinary. One only has to search the web for the types of resources that are available for enhancing and thriving and exciting elements of Jewish life. And we were free without any consequences to be a Jew in our private lives and in our public lives. And I remember back to my grandparents' phrase, it's difficult to become a Jew or to be a Jew. And we have a generation for whom it was easy. For a period of time, the length of which we do not know, it's no longer going to be easy. And Jews have to develop a thick skin and a tough skin. And we have to be motivated by our pride and our integrity to be able to face the travails that we're about to face at home, as the Israelis face the difficulties that they're going to face in securing their society. It means we have to revamp some of our education of our youngsters so that they go off to college armed with information and facts and understanding. It means that we have to tell our children that they need courage and they need toughness and they need discipline and they need pride in order to manifest themselves as a Jew. It means we don't want people to remove mezuzot. We don't want Jews to feel endangered. We want Jews to work together in a deep and profound way to not only create community, but to sustain solidarity and the like. That's a basic overview of where we are at this moment. And what I'd like to do is to invite you to enter the chat, and let's answer some of the questions that have been asked on the chat, and invite you to add to those questions as we go forward. Let me get them up and start answering them. Why do people mistake Hamas with Palestinians? Do you think disinformation is the reason why? Why do you think people are not focused on freeing the hostages and are focused on Palestinian aid and Israeli ceasefire? Let me answer that in a very real way, and we have to be careful about this. We do not know the degree to which the Hamas enjoys support from the Palestinian population. We do understand the Palestinian population are not particularly friends of Israel in any which way, manner, or form, but they have lived under difficult and relatively, and one can speak, inhumane conditions under Hamas's leadership since 2007. Let's also remember that Israel does not occupy the Gaza Strip. Israel ended its occupation in 2007, removed the settlements, and left Gaza as an economically viable entity, including a whole range of the glass houses in which you grow plants and the like. And Hamas decided to blow them up and to destroy them, figuring that they had the taint of Israel and the like, and they did not create conditions, livable conditions, for their own population. But we have to understand the reason we call it the war against Hamas is to remind ourselves that even after this war, the Jews will live with Palestinian neighbors, and they will have to live with a population in Gaza, and consequently, we cannot think of alienating the entire Palestinian population of Gaza. Why is the world putting pressure on Israel for a ceasefire? We said a ceasefire at this moment is a victory for Hamas, and it protects Hamas from the consequences of its action, which is why the United States in particular is not supporting a ceasefire. That's different in diplomatic terms than a period of time in which we have a cessation of hostilities for a humanitarian corridor. The world is putting immense pressure on Israel to cease fire. Do you see them pausing in a month or so? The question only becomes what progress has been made in that month and how far along in the battle plan Israel is. And let's also say something very clearly, which is not going to be very easy to say, but we have to look at it carefully. And that is that you hear the word and what, and after that, what? In other words, what is the game plan for ruling Gaza in the aftermath of the dismantling of Hamas? And I was deeply disturbed that Israeli leadership, in its anger in the moment after attack, promised things that it's not likely to be able to deliver, including the eradication of every fighter in Hamas. That's not going to be possible. But the question becomes, who steps in to rule Hamas, to rule Gaza? The Israelis certainly don't want to be engaged in the occupation. The Americans don't want to have an occupation of this territory. Is it an international community? Is it an Arab community? Who is it, and what are their responsibilities going to be? And one of the things that Secretary Blinken has been involved in meeting with the Israeli cabinet, and meeting with Israeli officials, and with Jordanian officials, and with Egyptian officials, and with Saudi officials, and equally importantly, with Qatari officials, is to figure out what the game plan is after the battle is ended. What's the day after? How much of the world and billions of people do you believe has the opinion that the only good Jew is a dead Jew? Look, let's not exaggerate the sense of anti-Semitism. For many people, they have no idea who the Jews are, and they couldn't give a care of who the Jews are or what the Jews are. We also enjoy a good deal of support. We face two forms of opposition in the United States. We face a opposition from the progressive left, which has now gotten into its mind. And I want to present the paradox. I'm going to present the paradox twice. The strength of Israel is its weakness. The weakness of Israel is its strength. Let me repeat that. The strength of Israel is its weakness. The weakness of Israel is its strength. What do I mean by that? Some believe that because Israel is strong, it can't be right, that all correctness, all political correctness lies with the underprivileged, and that this is the privileged attacking the underprivileged. And consequently, the strength of Israel is its weakness. The weakness of Israel is its strength. This goes back to the issue, and I'm going to say it and say it clearly. From military perspective, concern for either the civilian casualties or the hostages weakens Israel's ability to attack. So consequently, the fact that it values the hostages, sees them as people and not as a problem, but understands that it has responsibility for its own citizens, and the fact that it's also concerned about not inflicting overwhelming civilian casualties, means that the strength of Israel, its values, ironically turns out to be, from military perspective, its weakness. We have been disappointed in, especially Jews on the progressive side, have been disappointed in the fact that the progressives has not understood the fact that you can oppose policies of the state of Israel, but still believe that Israel must survive, should survive, is worthy of surviving, and Israel is of enormous value. They have not understood that, and they have opposed it almost mindlessly. And we have a disappointment with the progressive wings of American politics, in the same way that in 1967, we had a deep disappointment with those who were involved in the ecumenical movement, with the fact that church and that Catholic and Protestant church leaders did not speak up in solidarity with the state of Israel. And I remember a distinct case that in the free speech movement at Berkeley, the leader of the free speech movement at Berkeley discovered all of a sudden that he knew his wife was Jewish, but discovered that his wife was not only Jewish, but had deep and profound feelings for Israel. And he had to reacquaint himself with her after he had taken a position against Israel, and a strong position against Israel. And remember, then Israel was not regarded as powerful. Israel was regarded as fighting for its very basic existence, being surrounded on three sides by enemies who were threatening to drive it into the sea. So in that sense, it was again, the people we had been aligned with were silent, not understanding our anguish. I think we have much more understanding of our anguish at this moment, and we're experiencing much solidarity. I'm asked a question, let me get to it. Do I think normalization I talked about between Saudi Arabia and Israel has a chance of becoming a reality in the aftermath of the war? On this, I'm going to be a little bit optimistic and say the following. Saudi Arabia was seeking to normalize relations with Israel not because it loved Jews or even loved Israel, even cared for Israel deeply, but because of its own national interest. And by the way, national interest is a stronger basis upon which to go forward rather than sentiment or as it were, affection and the like. And its own national interest is that Saudi Arabia has realized something vitally important. We go back to 1973, whose anniversary, the Yom Kippur War, we commemorated on October 6th. Remember, we thought in 1973 that power in the last part of the 20th century and the 21st century would be in the control of natural resources. And Saudi Arabia had sat on vast reservoirs of oil. Saudi Arabia recognizes in a very interesting way that there's been another form of power that has developed in the last part of the 20th century and is essential in the 21st century, and that is a knowledge-based economy. A knowledge-based economy depends on the education and the capacity of its population. A knowledge-based economy, ironically, argues for women's rights because you can't work with only 50% of your population. You have to work with 100% of your population because knowledge is not restricted by gender. And it wants an alliance with the United States to counteract Iran, and therefore believes that it can't get an alliance with the United States, certainly not through the Senate of the United States, without an alliance with Israel. Its national interest will not change that dramatically, that suddenly, though it will have to contend with the opposition to Israel from what we call the street, namely the Arab population, and consequently will have to work a little bit harder for it. Saudi Arabia could have already denied Hamas its victory by saying we will normalize relations with Israel as if there was no war, and we will contend with the war as if there was no normalization of relations with Israel. That would have, as it were, already taken the major strength out of the success of Hamas in derailing the population. I have a question here from Susan Feingold. The strength of Gaza is Hamas, the weakness of Gaza is Hamas. How to convince U.S. campuses that Hamas is Amalek? I'm not sure how we convince U.S. campuses. I think the only way to convince U.S. campuses is what is partially happening. Number one is that segments of the faculty and of the student body are not as self-indulging of the desire for moral purity and simplicity on the part of elements of campus. And secondly, the students are discovering that there will be consequences later on for the statements they make. Interestingly enough, a series of law firms have written to Harvard Law School saying, please do not send us anti-Semites. We don't want them as part of our law class. And consequently, some of the people who signed these statements are finding that all of a sudden their job opportunities are not quite the same as they were. Faculty who are supportive of Israel have begun to speak out. And the student body of not only Jewish students, but Jewish students, their allies and their friends and others have begun to speak out. And that's terribly important. Amalek, as its nature, is the eternal enemy of the Jewish people and attacks the Jewish people wantonly. In the Bible, it's the group that attacked the Jewish people, the people of Israel, from behind, attacking its weakest link. I prefer to see enemies not in reincarnation of past enemies, but in the unique perspective that they offer themselves. And I have to say that Hamas is allied with Iran, and Iran has been doing something intriguing, which is it's fought a vicarious war, letting others battle for it and trying to pull the strings from behind. And the United States has done a very good job, a very good job of projecting military strength to counteract and warn the people not to go and warn the nations not to go along, as it were, with Iran and the like. What can be done with the United Nations? I leave that to other people. I don't have the answer. I understand the United Nations has been for a period of time problematic with regard to Israel at its best and catastrophic with regard to Israel at its worst. It has, number one, was responsible years ago for the Zionism as racism resolution. And let me indicate something about what Zionism is so we understand how to deal with the accusation Zionism is racism. Zionism is the attempt of the Jewish people to express its desire for national self-determination in a land to which we have a historical attachment, in a land that has been central to our religious faith. I don't need to tell you the number of times the word Jerusalem and Zion is mentioned in both our prayers and our Bible. There is no mention of Jerusalem whatsoever in the Quran. And the Jews have lived constantly in the land of Israel, albeit not sovereign in the land of Israel. And Jews did not come to Israel as colonialists. Jews came to Israel as people, and colonialists were people who came to exploit the land and take its treasures back home. Jews came to a land with very few resources to work the land, to serve the land, to make the land prosper. And now, in a very real sense, Jews have become Israel has become a major economic force with a per capita income up until the war that was the equivalent of Switzerland, based on a knowledge-based economy integrated into the technological economy of the world. It's one of the reasons I've been less worried about the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment of sanction movement, because you can't rip Israel out and Israeli technology out from the integrated technology of the world as we experience. And consequently, as everybody will tell you, BDS has been a pain and an irritant, but it has had virtually zero economic impact on Israel, which was called Startup Nation in a very real way. But unless Israel gets its act together, the globalized nature of its economy can take the strength of that economy and move it elsewhere. And that was one of the consequences of judicial reform, which has been suspended and I suspect will not come back for the foreseeable future. I've been asked in regards to speaking to teenagers and kids about anti-Semitism. When they ask questions, why does everyone hate the Jewish people, especially do what they're seeing on social media? Do you have some short answer? Do I have some short recommendation responses? Although anti-Semitism has a long history, but sometimes a lengthy explanation can't help kids. I think the first thing we have to tell our kids is that when the world hates the Jews, in one sense, it's their problem, not ours. The second thing is I want us to tell our kids that there are very many enormously positive reasons to be Jewish, that it's a source of pride, and it's a source of celebration, it's a source of values, and it's a source of meaning. And I want and this is what I share with my children as well. And my children, one of the things I tell them again and again is how much Israel means to me and how much Israel meant to my parents and that generation, because they have taken for granted the achievements of two generations in terms of the freedom that is afforded to them. And they can't take that freedom for granted. And I want Jews to be proud. I want Jews to be dignified, but I also want Jews to exhibit a certain tenacity and a certain strength and a certain willingness to affirm their values and to celebrate themselves and all that Jews and Judaism has to offer. It's not only community, it's meaning, it's sanctity, it's holiness, its significance, and it's the idea of the consecration of the world and the, what shall we say, and human values and human dignity and human decency. Since we're involved with the Holocaust Memorial, I want us also to say that we've had a false notion, as it were, that somehow Holocaust education would eradicate anti-Semitism. I think Holocaust education does an important job, and those who have had a Holocaust education are more sensitive not only to the Jewish experience, but to the values that are called forth, including the notion of the respect for the diversity of human beings, respect for religious freedom, respect for the sanctity and sacredness of each human life, appreciation of Jewish life and the Jewish world. But Holocaust education cannot do it on its own. I didn't say one more thing, which I'd like to say, which is that the haters now have unique tools. The haters have unique tools which include the following: that they have the internet, which is a megaphone that allows them to broadcast to the world without many major economic costs. And they also have social support networks that essentially mean they can't be isolated or separated. They can't be quarantined as we tried to do with the haters before. But they have a international community of those who share the light. We also have a problem of false information or and the like that is amplified by repetition. And all of these change the way in which we have to grapple with it. I've been asked to say anti-Semitism on two fronts in the United States. Number one is the progressive left, and number two is the Christian nationalist right. And we have a second sense of not anti-Semitism, but painful politics that's going to complicate our situation, which is the fact that we have a deeply isolationist wing on the right that wants no American involvement. And consequently, that is not going to bode well for the expression of American strength that is deeply essential, to protecting the United States and our allies in a world that is particularly dangerous.